Hey there, before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a story. I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let your mind drift. These horror stories will crawl under your skin and linger in the dark. Let's begin. The engine stuttered once, coughed like it had swallowed dust, and died in the heart of the Nevada desert. I was alone, unless you counted the dog I'd rescued a few months back. A brown mutt named Spanner, half German shepherd, half question mark. He stared up at me from the passenger seat, panting heavily, ears twitching at every breeze. The only thing surrounding us was sunburnt sand and crumbling wooden structures, a ghost town known as Rhyolite, just outside Death Valley. It had been off the map for over 100 years. The sky was blazing and I was sweating through my shirt when I popped the hood. I'd driven out here for photos, planning to camp overnight and get sunrise shots. The desolate bones of the town had drawn me in through online blogs, all vague about details, but raving about the haunting energy. Rhyolite wasn't a tourist stop. The locals said it had died hard and fast after a mine collapse in the early 1900s. No cleanup, no proper closure, just death and desert. When the engine wouldn't turn over again, I gave up and grabbed my gear. I figured I could shoot what I came for, wait out the heat, then hike the 5 miles back to the highway in the morning if I had to. I slung my camera over my shoulder, Spanner trotting close, and stepped into the hollow skeleton of the ghost town. The sun baked everything in a washed-out glow. Old wood groaned under my boots as I entered what must have once been a saloon. The bar still stood, barely, and broken glass glittered like teeth across the floor. I took some shots, then more, at what used to be a school, a few stone cottages, the rusted frame of a car. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, convinced I'd heard footsteps, but nothing moved except wind. I told myself it was just the acoustics of old wood and empty space. As dusk crept in, the color drained from the world. Spanner stopped wagging his tail and stayed pressed to my leg. I made a small fire in the open square and set up my tent nearby, though I doubted I'd use it. The air felt tight, electric, like before a storm, except there wasn't a cloud in the sky. I was editing a few shots on my laptop when Spanner stood up suddenly, his body stiff as a board. I paused, the hairs on my neck lifting. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Actual, unmistakable footsteps, crunching slowly across gravel and glass. They were close, too close. I shut the laptop and slowly reached into my backpack for my flashlight. Spanner didn't bark. He just growled lower, more urgent now. The fire flickered as if someone passed in front of it, casting a brief shadow that darted across the stone wall beside us. I spun and pointed the flashlight toward the sound. There was no one there, no footsteps retreating, no figures ducking behind buildings, just the sound of wind picking up again like a breath drawn in and held. Spanner was trembling. I tried to talk myself down. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was a trick of sound, bouncing off the canyon walls. I turned back to the fire and froze. There were wet footprints around it, bare feet, human. They hadn't been there before. I scanned the area again. Nothing, just the old wooden buildings swallowing the last of the light. I couldn't understand it. I hadn't heard anything but those steps. No voices. No breeze strong enough to scatter sand in such perfect shapes. I doused the fire immediately and packed up the laptop. The tent could stay. I wasn't sleeping out here. I decided we'd climb into the truck and lock the doors for the night. But the truck wasn't where I left it. I looked down the dirt road where it had broken down just hours ago, and there was nothing. No tire marks, no oil trail, just a flat stretch of desert as if it had never been there at all. My hands went cold. I should have been able to see it, even if someone towed it. There was only one road in and out of this place, and no sound of an engine, no headlights, nothing. I turned in a slow circle. Behind me, in the doorway of the ruined saloon, stood a man. He wasn't moving, just watching. He looked out of place in a way I couldn't put into words. His clothes were torn in patterns that didn't match any modern wear. He was barefoot, and something in his face was wrong. Not twisted, just faded, like an old photo where the details have melted away. I opened my mouth to speak, but he stepped backward into the dark, disappearing from view. Spanner lunged forward and barked, once, loud and sharp. The man was gone. I didn't chase after him. I didn't want to know where he went. I grabbed Spanner's leash and began walking. I didn't care how far the highway was anymore. I just needed distance. We had only made it about a quarter-mile out when I saw light ahead, a flickering glow like another fire. I hesitated. Maybe someone else had come out to camp. Maybe I wasn't alone. Then I heard the sound again, footsteps, only this time they were behind me. Spanner spun and barked furiously. I turned with the flashlight, still nothing. When I looked forward again, the firelight was gone. In its place stood the man again, closer now, still barefoot, still staring, and behind him more figures stepped out from the shadows. No sound, no breath, just a half circle of pale faces staring at me from the sand. I backed up slowly, Spanner snarling, my heart threatening to leap out of my chest. The figures didn't move, not until I turned to run. Then I heard them. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every part of me screamed to keep moving, to put space between me and whatever those things were. Spanner was beside me, matching my pace, growling deep and fast, like he was trying to hold off panic the same way I was. The night in the desert was colder than I expected. My breath came out in tight white clouds, and the flashlight's beam bounced wildly with every step. I aimed it toward the highway, though it was little more than a guess in the dark. My phone had died earlier. There was no signal when I'd tried it back at the camp. Nothing but static and silence. Behind us, the footsteps came again, dozens of them, crunching through gravel and sand. Not a word, but a kind of groan, like something pulling itself together for the first time in years. We kept running. Eventually, after what felt like miles, the footsteps faded. I slowed only because my legs started to seize up, burning with exhaustion. Spanner collapsed beside me, tongue lolling, chest heaving. We were in a ravine now. Low ground, surrounded by rocky bluffs, no sign of the road, just empty desert. That was when I realized something else. The stars had vanished. No moon, no clouds, just black, empty sky. And the silence, deafening, not even wind. I panned the flashlight around. I snapped the light back and saw one of them again. A woman this time, standing a few feet above me. Motionless on a ledge. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. Her eyes were like polished stones, black, empty. Her dress was torn, fluttering slightly, even though there was no breeze. I backed up slowly. Then another figure appeared behind her. Then two more, all watching. They didn't seem to care about the flashlight. I shined it directly on them, and they just stared back. Spanner growled again. This time, it sounded like a whimper, too. I had to get higher. The ravine felt like a trap. I climbed up one of the slopes, dragging myself by hand where the loose rock made it hard. Spanner stayed close. My legs were cramping, and my hands were bleeding by the time I pulled us over the edge. The walls were cracked but standing. I pushed inside and blocked the entrance with a slab of broken concrete. Inside, the darkness was thick. I dropped to the floor, panting. Spanner lay beside me. I kept the flashlight aimed at the entrance, heart racing in my chest like a second heartbeat. Minutes passed, nothing. Then I saw it. Not through the door, but through a crack in the stone wall. A face pressed right up against the gap. Not angry, just blank, pale, watching. I froze. The face disappeared. Something moved around the far side of the building. Then another knock on the stone, like fingertips, tapping, testing. I whispered to Spanner to stay quiet. He whimpered low, but didn't bark. The tapping stopped. And then, suddenly, everything was silent again. The next sound I heard was a voice. It came from the far side of the room, from inside the post office. A man's voice, weak and hoarse. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. I spun the flashlight and found him slumped in the corner. A man, maybe 50, with a sunburned face, tangled beard, and torn clothing. His skin looked dry, nearly cracked, like he hadn't had water in days. I didn't speak. I couldn't. "They come out when people forget," he said, "when people stop looking. This town died hard. No one buried them right. No one left a prayer. They just faded." I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" He looked up slowly. "I've been here a long time. Thought I'd leave someday. Thought maybe someone would come who could help." He smiled then, but it was the kind of smile that doesn't belong on a living face. His teeth were too white, too straight. His lips didn't quite move right. That was when I saw the fly crawl out of his ear and disappear into his beard. I stepped back. Spanner barked. A sharp, panicked burst. The man stood fast, too fast. His body jerked in a way that made my stomach turn. "You should go now," he said. And then the walls shook. Something slammed into the building, hard enough to crack the stone. Dust rained down from the ceiling. I threw my body against the slab at the door, trying to keep it in place. The second hit knocked it free. They came through the opening like smoke, figures in the dark, some crawling, some walking, all silent now. They moved like they didn't care about obstacles, climbing over the broken slab, dragging themselves across the floor. I grabbed Spanner and ran for the back of the building. The rear wall had a hole near the bottom, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I didn't think. I shoved Spanner through first, then crawled after him. My jeans ripped on the stone. My arms bled. We were out in the open again. The man didn't follow. He stood in the doorway, smiling, eyes empty. The ghost town was behind us now, but not far enough. We ran until I saw the flicker of headlights. A truck, real this time, barreling down the dirt road, kicking up dust. I ran into its path, waving my arms. It screeched to a halt. A ranger stepped out, hand on his belt. "What the hell are you doing out here?" he asked. I couldn't speak. I collapsed, gripping Spanner, gasping. He helped me into the truck and gave me water. I must have looked insane. "I've been patrolling this area for 20 years, he said. "Nobody goes to Rhyolite at night, not unless they want to disappear." He didn't ask more questions. He didn't need to. I never went back. I sold the camera, deleted the photos, and never told anyone the full truth. But I know what I saw. I know what followed me into that place. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound again, footsteps on gravel. And I wonder how far they really can go. Story 2. In the scorched basin of southwestern Arizona, the ghost town of Swansea lies sunken and brittle among the Red Rock Hills. Once a mining camp for copper, Swansea had its heyday in the early 1900s. But by the 1930s, the town was abandoned. The desert claimed its streets, swallowing the wooden buildings and machinery in dust. What happened in 1979, though, had nothing to do with mining or geology. It was the disappearance of a man named Carter Avery and the chilling circumstances around it that made Swansea infamous again for a brief moment. Carter wasn't a thrill-seeker or urban explorer. He was a field surveyor contracted by the Arizona Department of Water Resources. In July 1979, he was tasked with measuring water table levels near the old town site. It was supposed to be a routine solo job. Drive in, take the readings, and leave by evening. He signed in with the department office in Parker that morning, let his wife know he'd be back before dark, and headed into the heat. When Carter didn't return that evening, his wife called the office. They assumed car trouble. But the next morning, when no one could reach him by radio, a search team was dispatched. His department truck was found parked exactly where it should have been. Outside the skeletal remnants of the Swansea processing mill, keys in the ignition, paperwork still on the passenger seat. His gear was all there, except for his canteen, compass, and one field notebook. It looked like he had simply walked off into the ruins. The ground was scoured by searchers. Helicopters circled overhead, and dogs were brought in. Though the sweltering heat and crumbled buildings made scent trails difficult. But they found something strange near the edge of a collapsed smelter room. A rusted iron hatch had been uncovered, its cover kicked open, with the outline of a fresh boot scrape on the metal. It led into an old ventilation shaft that hadn't been documented in any official maps. A narrow, steep tunnel dropped into a sub-basement chamber beneath the smelter, choked in soot and broken brick. Carter's boot prints were clearly visible in the dust at the bottom, but there was something else. Near the far wall of the chamber, searchers found a set of deeper, heavier tracks. Not boots, something broader, more sunken, barefoot impressions. They led in a half circle around Carter's tracks, then vanished into a dead wall. That's where the search stopped cold. The air inside that chamber was unbearable. No one could explain why it felt so much colder than the outside heat. One of the searchers, a geologist named Ellis, refused to go back in, claiming he heard something whispering from behind the wall where the prints ended. He refused to talk about what it said, only that it sounded like a prayer said backward. The official search was called off after 3 days. No body was ever found. Carter's wife insisted on returning one last time with 2 friends and a private investigator. They camped outside the ruins for one night. At dawn, she swore she heard Carter's voice from inside the smelter, weak and dry, calling her name twice. The others heard nothing. When they entered the building, the hatch was sealed shut again, sealed from the inside. No tracks around it. They reopened the hatch and found the shaft exactly as it had been left. Dust, undisturbed. No new footprints. But Carter's compass was sitting in the center of the chamber floor, clean and upright. It hadn't been there before. The local sheriff closed the case, Cause of disappearance: undetermined. The report mentioned dehydration, exposure, possible fall, but people who read between the lines didn't buy it. Swansea became one of those places hikers avoided, even if maps marked it as a site of interest. Some said the town was cursed. Others said Carter found something underground that was never meant to be uncovered. But the question still hangs unanswered. Who or what left those barefoot prints, and why were they circling him? The compass was standing upright in the center of the chamber floor. Carter's wife stared at it, frozen at the threshold of the hatch. The dust beneath the compass was undisturbed, like it had been placed there from above, rather than dropped or kicked. The chamber was exactly as the search team had left it, except for that one item. The private investigator, Ron Helling, scanned the room with a flashlight, his beam crawling over the stone walls. "It wasn't there yesterday," he said, voice low, not for effect, but out of something closer to respect or fear. They descended slowly. Ron first, then Carter's wife, Elise, and her brother-in-law Dean. Elise's hands trembled as she lowered herself down. She didn't believe in curses or spirits, not until now. Dean stepped forward and carefully picked up the compass. It was cool, too cool for the surrounding heat. There were no footprints, no indentations around it, and yet the dust was cleared in a perfect circle where it sat, like it had been placed with surgical precision. Then Elise noticed it. The hatch above them, which they'd pushed open from the outside, had shifted. It hadn't shut completely, but it was no longer open as wide as they'd left it. It hung just ajar, as if something had nudged it closed from the inside. Dean gave Ron a look and started back up the ladder to check. The instant he reached the top and pushed the hatch open, he staggered back down 2 steps and cursed under his breath. The air had changed. Gone was the hot, dry wind. It was quiet now. Too quiet. No birds, no bugs, not even the breeze that had moved across the desert just 10 minutes earlier. Ron emerged next and looked around. The ruins of the smelter cast long shadows in the morning sun. Everything was still in place except the truck. Carter's work truck, which had been parked right beside the ruins, was gone. There were no tracks, no tire marks in the dry dust, just the wide, clear space where it had stood, with the same outline in the sand and the slight oil stain beneath it. Elise climbed out last. Her mouth opened in a soundless gasp when she saw what had replaced the truck. In its place sat a metal folding chair. On the seat was a notebook, Carter's field notebook, the one missing from the cab. Ron opened it carefully. The first few pages were just what they expected. Notes, readings, location sketches. Then the handwriting changed. The rest of the pages were filled with a scrawl, black ink, looping, almost frantic, as if written in one continuous rush. No punctuation, no breaks. Some words were English, others weren't, and near the end, something was scribbled over and over. He turned wrong, he turned wrong, he turned wrong. Not supposed to see me, see me, see me. It's under the rock, it's under the dust, under the teeth, under the wall. It watches from below. The final page was torn out. They left Swansea without another word. Elise refused to speak about the trip again. Dean had to be sedated during the ride home. Ron filed a report and then vanished from public record. His private license was never renewed. His wife later told reporters that he began sleepwalking and waking up covered in dirt, hands scratched raw as if digging. He stopped sleeping entirely by the next year, took his own life in 1981. Years later, hikers came across an abandoned government-issued truck buried under a sand drift about half a mile from Swansea. It was upright, keys in the ignition, doors locked from the inside. Inside, a single black boot was found in the passenger seat. Nothing else. No one goes near the smelter now. Not after what happened to Carter. Not after what happened to Ron. Locals say if you find yourself near the edge of town at dusk, you'll hear something tapping on metal beneath your feet. If you follow the sound, it gets quieter. But if you walk away, it gets louder and louder, until it's not tapping anymore. Until it sounds like something clawing to get out. There's a reason Swansea remains empty. Some ghost towns died because the mines ran dry. Swansea feels like it was emptied. Like something cleared it out and left the buildings behind. And something else stayed. Story 3. The ghost town of Centralia, Pennsylvania, doesn't appear threatening from a distance. Rows of buckled asphalt, fading road lines, and skeletal homes swallowed by trees make it look more like a forgotten construction site than a place once thriving with life. But what lies beneath Centralia has burned for decades. A coal seam fire that started in 1962 continues to rage underground, and though most residents evacuated over the years, one story from 1981 remains one of the most disturbing events ever tied to the town. It involved a boy named Todd Domboski. He was 12 years old at the time and had lived in Centralia his whole life. His family was among the few who hadn't yet been relocated. Most others were already gone, leaving behind homes with boarded windows and collapsing porches. The air always smelled faintly of sulfur, and cracks in the ground oozed heat in winter. Everyone had learned to live with the smoke. On February 14, 1981, Todd was playing in his grandmother's backyard. Snow had melted early that year, revealing soft patches of exposed earth. As Todd walked across the yard toward an old shed, the ground beneath him suddenly gave way. Without warning, a sinkhole opened, and he dropped into it up to his shoulders. The earth didn't crumble. It seemed to inhale. A hissing noise, a puff of gas, and then silence. He screamed. His cousin, who was nearby, heard the cries and ran over. Todd was barely clinging to the roots along the edge of the hole, which was over 4 feet wide and at least 100 feet deep. Below him, steam was rising. It reeked of scorched plastic and rotten eggs. The boy was pulled free just in time. Moments later, the soil around the hole collapsed further. If his cousin had arrived even 30 seconds later, Todd would have vanished. That's the part you'll find in newspapers. It's a documented incident. The sinkhole was real, and the government finally responded by accelerating the evacuation of Centralia. But what isn't in the papers are the details Todd gave in the days after. His family kept it quiet. Perhaps out of fear, people would dismiss it as stress or trauma. Only later did his uncle, a coal inspector named Don Smith, mention it during a deposition when testifying about the town's dangers. According to Dan, Todd described something strange inside the hole, not just heat and gas. He claimed he saw movement below, figures shifting in the haze, shapes walking in a wide tunnel beneath the backyard. He said they looked like people, but not quite, like silhouettes walking backward. When asked how he knew they were walking backward, Todd said, "Because their faces never looked at me, but their eyes did." The story was dismissed at the time. But several years later, in 1987, another strange report emerged. A demolition crew brought in to tear down one of the old buildings refused to return after their equipment malfunctioned. The ground shook when they tried to operate a backhoe, and a section of the street split down the middle. A thick plume of smoke burst up, and 3 workers swore they saw a figure standing on the other side, motionless, thin, just visible through the smoke, and not wearing any protective gear. It stood still for 10 full seconds, then vanished when the wind shifted. Photos taken during that demolition were reviewed by environmental officials, and in the corner of one image, barely noticeable at first, was a tall, shadowy figure at the edge of a collapsed cellar. No one could say what it was. No one ever claimed to have seen it again. The town was officially condemned in 1992. Most residents left, and homes were razed or buried. But even today, the ground around Centralia breathes. Steam vents out from fissures, and the soil grows warm near the cemeteries. A single stretch of road, known as Graffiti Highway, became popular with tourists until it was finally covered over with dirt to prevent more visits. And yet, people still go. In 2005, a pair of amateur urban explorers from Philadelphia posted online that they camped near the site of the original sinkhole. They claimed they followed a thin trail of warmth in the soil until they reached an area with shallow grave sites and burned tree roots poking from the earth like bones. One of them said they heard whispering from a vent in the ground, like someone speaking in a low, choking voice. The other explorer, according to the same post, went missing for nearly an hour before emerging from behind a hill, barefoot, eyes wide, mumbling something about seeing the boy. They deleted the post a week later. No explanation. Todd Dombowski is still alive. He doesn't talk publicly about that day anymore. The last time he did, during a local interview in the early 2000s, he said something odd. When asked how it felt to nearly die in that sinkhole, he said, "It wasn't the falling in that scared me. It was that I didn't hit the bottom. Something down there caught the air like it was waiting." Todd's words echoed long after the interview ended. Something down there caught the air like it was waiting. The local reporter, a woman named Lynn West, had chalked it up to poetic phrasing. She didn't think much more of it until a few months later, when she received an anonymous envelope in her mailbox. Inside was a grainy photograph. It showed a section of scorched ground near the old Centralia cemetery, cracked and oozing steam. But it wasn't the ground that made her stomach twist. It was what stood near the edge of the fissure. The figure was long-limbed and too pale, almost featureless. It was facing away from the camera, with shoulders hunched and arms extended, like it was reaching toward the hole. There were no footprints in the ash nearby, no tire tracks, nothing to indicate how whoever or whatever it was had gotten there. The photo was unsigned, no note, just the image. And on the back, written in faint pencil, "You saw what he saw." Lynn never published the story. She left the paper a few years later and moved out of Pennsylvania entirely. But that photo didn't vanish. It ended up in the hands of a local historical society volunteer named Henry Rollins, who had been collecting unofficial documents and rumors about Centralia since the 1980s. Henry confirmed that he'd been cataloging witness reports, interviews, and strange occurrences that were never officially acknowledged. Most were easy to dismiss: teenagers with overactive imaginations, fires caused by trespassers, even a few hoaxes. But one entry stood out. In 1996, a pair of environmental scientists were sent to monitor underground gas levels in the area near the Dombowski sinkhole. Their equipment was basic: gas sensors, seismic monitors, and an infrared camera for checking underground temperatures. They set up their station just 50 feet from where Todd had fallen 15 years earlier. Everything was normal until the second night. The motion camera picked up something near the perimeter. The first image was blurry, the second showed nothing, but the third was sharper. A faint outline of what looked like a person leaning over the soil near the gas vent. When they reviewed the footage, both men agreed that no one had entered or exited the site. There were no boot prints, no signs of tampering, yet the figure in the stills was real. One of the scientists, Dr. Ellis Monroe, refused to return the next day. The other, Richard Kyle, stayed behind to finish the readings. He never checked out. The agency assumed he'd wandered off into the hills or succumbed to a collapse in the unstable soil. But Henry tracked down the original police report years later and found a detail that was never made public. Kyle's tent was still there. His food, backpack, and radio were untouched. But the center of the camp had a wide, circular patch of scorched earth about 5 feet across. The grass and topsoil were burned straight through, but only in that circle. The edges were clean, like a stovetop burner had been pressed into the ground. In the very center, a single boot print pointed toward the open field. It didn't match Kyle's boots. It was larger, longer, and the heel was strangely arched, like the foot had too many joints. After that incident, all formal monitoring of Centralia ceased. The government closed the last public road to the area in 2002, and remaining residents were bought out or pressured into relocation. But unofficial visits continued. In 2010, a small team of paranormal researchers attempted a final expedition to the Domboski sinkhole site. They live-streamed portions of the trip for their modest online following. The stream went dark after sunset. When they returned to Signal, only one team member came back. Her name was Sasha Reyes. She didn't speak for 2 days. When she finally did, she claimed that one of her friends had dropped a thermal sensor into a narrow crack near the cemetery. It didn't hit the bottom, she said. We waited for the thud. We heard something else instead. Breathing. Then the sensor was thrown back up. I swear to God, it hit me in the leg. Something down there caught it and gave it back. The authorities dismissed her account as stress and shock. But Sasha moved away within weeks and stopped speaking publicly about the experience. Her blog, which had documented urban exploration for years, was wiped clean. Every post, every image, deleted. Todd Domboski, now in his 50s, lives under a different name. He's declined all interviews, but in a 2007 letter to an old friend, which surfaced after that friend passed away, he wrote a single line that has since haunted those who study Centralia's history. There's no bottom in that town, just something waiting for you to look too long. The coal fire continues to burn beneath Centralia. It could go on for another 100 years. The heat is still rising. The cracks still spread. And sometimes, when the wind shifts just right and the vents hiss softly into the night, hikers say it sounds like voices speaking through ash, not screaming, just talking, waiting. Story 4. I had been hunting ghost towns for years. It started as a fascination. Abandoned places, lost time, the echoes of people who vanished without fanfare. I told myself it was just history, but I knew deep down I wanted to see something impossible, something real. That's what led me to Coldwater, Arizona, A place that locals insisted never existed, though the name showed up in a few brittle, scattered government maps from the early 1900s. The more people told me to stop digging, the deeper I went. I should have listened. It took 3 days of driving dirt trails and hiking through dry brush before I saw the church steeple poking out over the horizon. The rest of the town seemed to sag around it, leaning buildings with shattered windows, wooden frames blackened by fire or time. There were no roads leading into cold water, just a fading path you could only follow if you knew exactly where to look. I arrived just before sundown, my backpack stuffed with water, batteries, a journal, and 2 cameras. I set up camp on the outskirts, beside what looked like the collapsed remains of an old general store. I remember thinking how the place felt buried, like the desert was trying to pull it back into the earth. But I was too proud of my discovery to care. The first thing I noticed was how intact some of the buildings still were. The saloon still had its swinging doors. The post office had mailbags rotting on the counter. The church, oddly enough, had fresh white candles on the altar, though everything else was choked with dust. I spent the evening exploring, photographing, documenting. The sun dipped low behind the hills, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. It wasn't until I stood inside the old sheriff's office that I felt the shift. The cells in the back were rusted and empty, but the door to one had been freshly opened. It groaned slightly, like someone had pushed it wide and left it waiting. On the floor, I saw footprints in the dust, bare feet, small, child-sized. They led from the open cell out the back door and vanished. I stepped outside, flashlight flickering over old hitching posts and broken windows. The air was still. No wind, no insects, no animal sounds, just me. I followed where I thought the footprints would have gone, ending up at a small house on the far edge of town. The door creaked open before I touched it. Inside was colder than the desert should have allowed. The walls were covered in peeling floral wallpaper, and in the center of the room sat a child's chair. On it was a doll, hand-stitched, with button eyes and a smile that had been sewn in too wide. Its arms were stretched out like it had been waiting for someone. I backed away and turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. My flashlight went out for a second, just a second, and when it came back on, the doll was gone. I left that house in a hurry, not running but close to it. I made for my camp, trying to convince myself it had all been coincidence, wind, vibration, the shifting of old wood. But when I reached my tent, it had been torn open, not shredded or slashed, but peeled back, like something had climbed inside. Nothing had been taken, nothing had been moved, except the journal. It was now lying open by the fire pit, flipped to a blank page, and in the center was a single line written in dark red ink. "Do you remember what you did?" I hadn't written it. I was miles from the nearest town. I picked up the journal with shaking hands and tore out the page. But the words were still there, etched faintly into the next sheet beneath. I closed the journal, packed everything, and decided I'd leave at first light. That night, I lay awake in my sleeping bag, watching the shadows stretch across the inside of my tent. Somewhere in the distance, I heard what sounded like a child's laughter, high-pitched, hollow. It came from the direction of the church. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited for the sun. When morning came, I started walking. I didn't bother to follow the path. I went in a straight line across the desert, moving faster than I should have. I walked for over 2 hours before I stopped to take a drink and look back. Cold water was still there, closer than before. I should have been well past it, out of sight, but the steeple was visible behind a ridge. The town was following me, or maybe I had never left. I tried using my compass. It spun wildly. My GPS blinked and reset, showing I was in New Mexico, then Utah, then nowhere. The same dirt trail stretched ahead, but it never led out. By noon, I found myself back in front of the sheriff's office. I don't remember turning around. I don't remember choosing to return. I just blinked, and I was there again. Something was different this time. The front door was closed. Hanging from the handle was a noose made of barbed wire. Inside, the cells were occupied. Each one held a figure, not alive, not entirely dead either. Mummified people, dressed in worn 1800s clothing, sat slumped against the bars, their heads bowed, and each of them was holding a journal, a different one, leather-bound, cloth-bound, spiral notebooks, all clutched tightly to their chests. One figure, a man in a deputy's uniform, looked up at me. His eyes were sunken, no lips, just teeth stretched tight under dry skin. "Do you remember what you did?" he rasped. I bolted. I didn't stop to pack. I didn't take photos. I ran into the desert without a compass, without a plan. I just ran. But I kept ending up back at the edge of town. Cold water wouldn't let me go. As the sun began to sink again, I found myself outside the church. The front door stood wide open. Candles were lit inside. I didn't want to go in, but I had no choice. At the altar, the doll sat waiting, and next to it was my journal, open to a new page. "You're ready now. It's time to confess." And then the church doors slammed shut. The bell began to ring, and the pews began to fill. The bell's toll shook the rafters. Each ring sounded too close, as if the metal tongue inside the tower were just above my head. Not stories above. Dust rained down with every chime, and still I stood there, frozen, facing the altar where the doll sat with its stitched grin, and my journal lay open, the ink still fresh on the page. Behind me, the sound of feet scraping would made my chest seize. I turned slowly, hoping, praying that it was just wind through the broken boards. But the pews weren't empty anymore. They were filling, one by one, with the same dried, leathery figures I had seen in the cells. Each moved like they had no joints, like their bones had fused together long ago. Yet somehow they still walked, slow and sure, dragging old boots and clawed hands. One of them, a woman in a tattered shawl, had a baby's bonnet clenched in her fingers. She stared at me as she sat down, head tilted, lips parted, as if whispering a prayer. I stepped back, toward the altar, unsure if I was retreating or being drawn in. The candles flickered, though there was no breeze, and the shadows they cast were wrong. They moved like figures, stretching long arms across the floor, reaching for me. "You're ready now," came a voice. It wasn't human. It didn't echo off the walls. It spoke from somewhere inside my head. "You know what you did. Say it." I couldn't speak. My throat was tight, my mouth dry. I looked down at the journal, hoping it would say something else, maybe a way out. But the words had changed again. Tell the truth, or stay forever. My legs gave out. I dropped to my knees before the altar, barely able to breathe. The weight of the air pressed down on me, thick as water, suffocating. I flipped back through the pages of my journal, looking for my notes, my sketches, anything familiar. Every page now bore the same sentence, written over and over. Tell the truth. I slammed it shut. "I don't know what you want," I shouted. "I didn't do anything." Laughter echoed through the church, not joyful laughter, mocking, cruel. The doll's head twitched toward me, and for the first time I realized it wasn't stitched to the chair. It had no strings, no stand. It was sitting on its own, watching. The bell rang again, once, and the church doors opened inward. A little girl walked in, barefoot, with a white dress stained with dirt and something darker. Her eyes were solid black, no iris, no white, just depth. She walked straight toward me, each step loud on the wooden floor. She stopped just a foot away and held out her hand. "Give it," she said. I didn't ask what. I handed her the journal. She took it with a small nod, then walked past me and sat at the front pew. The doll vanished from the altar. In its place was a revolver, old, rusted, 6-shot. I recognized it. I had seen that gun before, in a museum back in Phoenix. It had belonged to Sheriff Luther Kane. Story 5. If I had just ignored the post, maybe none of this would have happened. It was a grainy photo on an obscure travel forum, an old roadside motel called the Hollow Pines Motor, half buried in Utah dust. The caption read, "Anyone ever stay here? Locals say it's cursed. Nobody's checked in since 1991. I thought it was nonsense, just the kind of urban legend that floats around ghost towns. But then someone replied underneath, claiming they'd gone searching for it and found nothing. The coordinates didn't even point to a real road that got my attention. I was already in Utah at the time, solo hiking through abandoned mining towns and collecting footage for a horror doc series. I figured a ghost motel would be the perfect next location. The coordinates brought me to an unpaved road off Route 191, not even marked on most maps. It was evening when I finally saw it, the roofline barely visible over a ridge of mesquite trees and dirt. The sign was rusted and half buried in sand, but the neon tubing still spelled out Hollow Pines. The place looked preserved in that weird, unnatural way that only desert heat can manage. 12 rooms lined both sides of a cracked horseshoe driveway. The office door hung open like it had been waiting for someone. Inside, I found a check-in desk, dust-covered guest book, and a bowl of rusted keys still hanging from pegs. The calendar on the wall read July 1991, with a red circle around the 16th. That was the day it supposedly closed. I set up my gear in room 6. The bed was still made, like someone had left in a hurry. There was even a half-full bottle of cola on the nightstand, though the label was sun-bleached to white. I filmed some B-roll, recorded an intro, and planned to explore the other rooms in the morning. But when night fell, something shifted. The temperature dropped fast. I chalked it up to desert weather, but the silence became unbearable. No bugs, no wind, not even the hum of my own breath in my ears. It was like the whole place was sealed in a vacuum. Around 11 p.m., I heard a knock on the wall. Not the door, the wall between my room and the next. I froze. I hadn't seen anyone else for miles. I waited, thinking maybe it was a branch or rodent, but the knock came again, steady, 3 times. I grabbed my flashlight and pressed my ear to the wall. Nothing, no movement. I stepped outside, barefoot, flashlight shaking in my hand. Room 7's door was closed, but the light inside flickered faintly, like a lamp barely holding onto life. I reached out and turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing a room nearly identical to mine. But the bed was stripped, the sheets balled up in a corner. On the wall, above the headboard, someone had scratched a message into the paint. "Don't let them in." My stomach turned. I stepped closer, filming, thinking maybe it was graffiti left by vandals. But the message wasn't old. The scratches were fresh. The drywall dust was still on the floor. I backed out quickly, slammed the door, and looked around the empty lot. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the lights on, the door locked, my tripod aimed at the window. But around 2 a.m., the hallway outside my room filled with footsteps. Not just one person, multiple. They didn't run, they shuffled, dragged. A low whisper came through the door. "Open up." I held my breath, hoping it would stop. The voice came again. "It's cold out here." Then, as if they'd never been there, the silence returned. I reviewed the footage from my camera and saw only static. Not even the walls of the room showed up. Just snow, like something had jammed the lens. I wanted to leave at dawn, but when I stepped outside, I saw the strangest thing. The lot had changed. The driveway was gone, buried in loose sand and fresh pine needles. Pines in the desert. I walked the perimeter and saw a second motel building that hadn't been there the night before. Its windows were black, the doors closed tight, and behind it stood a row of trees, impossibly tall, clustered too closely to walk between. The trees hadn't been there when I arrived. The whole motel had shifted, like it had been waiting for something to click into place. Like I was the missing piece. I ran back to my car and tried to start it. The engine clicked once, then went silent. The battery was dead. The phone had no signal. I stood on the hood and looked around, trying to spot the road, but it was gone. Only more trees. I decided to pack what I could and start walking. I took the main key from the office, just in case I needed shelter again, and stepped toward the woods. As soon as I crossed the parking lot's edge, I felt it, like stepping through a film of static. The air buzzed. The shadows shifted unnaturally. The further I went, the more the motel seemed to fade behind me, until it wasn't behind me anymore. It was ahead of me. Same lot, same office, same scratched message on room 7's wall. I hadn't moved. Or maybe the place had moved with me. I staggered forward, yelling, trying to scream the silence away. But the trees seemed to eat my voice. Then I heard music, soft piano, warbling like it came from an old radio. It was coming from the office. I stepped in slowly. The guest book was gone. The keys were gone. Behind the counter, the floor had collapsed into a dark pit that led beneath the building. And from that hole, the music played louder. I was shaking so hard, I couldn't hold the flashlight straight. A voice drifted up from the hole. "Check in. Just check in." That's when I realized my name had been added to the wall calendar. July 16th, circled in red, same as everyone else. And now, it was today. The voice echoed again, soft but insistent, pulling me toward the gaping hole beneath the counter. My flashlight trembled in my hand, casting long shadows that danced along the peeling wallpaper. The music, a slow, haunting piano melody, grew louder, its eerie notes wrapping around me like a cold fog. I knew I should run, that every instinct screamed to flee, but something heavier than fear held me rooted. I forced myself to look down into the darkness. The pit seemed bottomless, swallowing the light hole. There was no ladder, no rope, only a faint glow from below, flickering like candlelight. With trembling legs, I stepped forward and lowered myself onto the floor, inching toward the edge. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, but the piano kept playing, guiding me deeper into the shadows. Suddenly, a cold hand closed around my wrist, squeezing tight enough to hurt. I yanked away, turning to see a woman standing behind me, her skin pale and translucent, eyes hollow wells of sorrow. She wore a tattered dress stained with dirt and dried blood, her hair tangled and wild. "You should not be here," she whispered, her voice breaking like dry leaves. "Who are you?" I managed. She shook her head slowly. "We are trapped. The hollow pines took us all." Every soul that entered on July 16th, 1991, became part of the motel. We never left. We cannot leave. The air thickened, and more figures appeared around us, their faces twisted in despair. The woman reached out, touching my cheek, cold as ice. "You must help us. Tell the truth. Free us." I swallowed hard. What truth? What happened here? Her eyes filled with tears, and the other ghosts murmured around us. It was a cover-up. The motel's owners were involved in something terrible. Illegal dumping, poisoning the water, destroying the land. When the townsfolk found out, they confronted them. The owners called the sheriff, who sided with the company. Then, one night, everyone vanished. The truth was buried with them. The motel became a prison for their souls, feeding off anyone who tried to uncover the secret. A surge of anger and sadness hit me. I clenched my fists. "How do I set you free?" The woman smiled sadly. "You must stay until dawn. Listen to the stories and promise to tell the world. Only then will the curse lift." The ghosts began to move, circling me slowly, sharing their stories, whispers of betrayal, loss, and fear. I recorded everything, my hands steady now, despite the cold. Hours passed. The sun's first light seeped through the cracked windows, bathing the motel in a golden glow. The spirits grew faint, their forms dissolving like morning mist. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice barely audible. "Remember us." As the last ghost vanished, the motel's walls shimmered and faded. I found myself standing alone on the dusty road, the sign gone, replaced by a dirt clearing.